This is not a video most people should hear. Not because the ideas are hidden, but because once you understand them, you cannot unknow them. Silence stops being empty. Absence stops being neutral. And every interaction you enter changes shape the moment you decide not to fill the space. Most men are taught to speak, to clarify, to explain, to correct misunderstandings before they grow uncomfortable. They believe silence is weakness, or worse, social failure. An awkward gap, a mistake that must be repaired quickly before someone notices. That instinct is precisely why silence works. The void you are about to understand is not passive. It is not politeness. It is not calm for calm's sake. It is pressure without motion. A psychological vacuum that destabilizes people who need noise to feel real. When nothing comes back from you, they begin to supply everything themselves. Explanations, justifications, confessions, insecurities they didn't plan to reveal. Most people cannot tolerate unfilled space. Their minds rush to complete patterns, to restore equilibrium, to remove uncertainty. Silence denies them that relief. It forces them inward, where they are least disciplined. This is why the void is dangerous. Not because it attacks, but because it waits. It does not push. It does not argue. It simply removes resistance and lets the other person collapse under the weight of their own need to be seen, heard, validated, or understood. Understand this clearly before we go further. This is not about domination. It is not about intimidation. And it is not about manipulation in the crude sense. Those who seek control through force reveal themselves too quickly. They burn leverage the moment they open their mouths. The void works precisely because it appears to do nothing. In unstable systems, stillness is interpreted as threat. When reactions stop, people begin to project meaning where none is given. They assume judgment. They assume disapproval. They assume knowledge. The less you confirm or deny, the more power they attribute to you. Not because you claim it, but because their mind cannot leave the gap unresolved. This is why silence rearranges power dynamics without effort. Most men negotiate against themselves because they are afraid of being misunderstood. They offer explanations no one demanded. They soften statements that were already accepted. They give away information simply to relieve tension. Every word they add is a concession disguised as communication. The void refuses that instinct. When you do not rush to clarify, others begin to do the work for you. They talk themselves into positions. They reveal priorities. They expose fears through tone, pacing, and repetition. The quiet space becomes a mirror they cannot stop looking into. This makes people uncomfortable. Not immediately, but gradually. At first, they fill the silence casually. Small talk, harmless additions. Then the tempo changes. Their voice tightens. They begin to over-explain. They check your reaction and find none. That absence becomes louder than any accusation. At this point, the imbalance begins. They start negotiating internally, out loud. They offer compromises you never asked for. They justify decisions you never challenged. They attempt to read your silence as approval, then as doubt, then as disapproval, all within the span of minutes. You haven't moved, but the ground under them has shifted. This is the vacuum at work. Silence removes friction. Without resistance, momentum turns inward. People collide with their own thoughts. The disciplined man understands this not as a trick, but as a natural law. Nature abhors a vacuum. Minds do too. If you do not supply noise, they will. and what they supply is rarely flattering to themselves.
This is why most people cannot use silence intentionally.
It requires internal stability. You must be able to sit inside uncertainty without needing to resolve it. You must be willing to let others misunderstand you temporarily. You must resist the urge to manage perceptions in real time. Weak men cannot tolerate this. They break the silence to reclaim comfort, not leverage. They speak to soothe themselves, not to communicate necessity. In doing so, they reveal exactly where they stand. The void demands restraint, and restraint demands self-knowledge. If this introduction unsettles you, that's not accidental. You are already feeling the pull of the vacuum, the awareness that power does not always announce itself, that pressure does not require movement, that silence, when held deliberately, becomes a force others cannot lean against.
What follows is not instruction in cruelty. It is a description of a mechanism that already exists, one that has been shaping negotiations, hierarchies, and outcomes long before anyone gave it a name. The question is not whether the void works. The question is whether you can stand inside it without flinching. The mistake most people make when they first encounter silence as a force is assuming it is something you do, a tactic, a posture, a move in a game. That misunderstanding exposes them immediately. Silence that is performed collapses under pressure. Silence that is inhabited reshapes the room. True silence is not absence of sound. It is absence of need. Systems that rely on reaction fear this more than opposition. When there is nothing to push against, no signal to interpret, no emotion to read, instability increases. People are conditioned to navigate through feedback loops: approval, rejection, clarification, disagreement. Silence interrupts the loop. It breaks the rhythm others depend on to orient themselves. This is why stillness unnerves. A reactive person lives externally. Their state is determined by input: tone, response time, facial cues, micro-affirmations. They adjust constantly, unconsciously negotiating for safety and certainty. When those signals disappear, they are forced inward. And inward is where most people are least structured. The immovable person is the opposite. He does not require continuous feedback to remain steady. His internal frame is intact. Silence does not destabilize him because he is not using conversation to regulate his identity. He speaks when there is something necessary to say, not when tension demands release. This distinction is ancient, though rarely stated plainly. Power that moves slowly is harder to resist than power that rushes. What accelerates reveals itself. What remains still forces others to circle it, measure it, and guess at its boundaries. In that guessing, they expose their own limits. Silence functions like gravity. You do not see it acting, but everything adjusts around it. The more mass something has, the less it needs to move to exert influence. A man with internal weight does not chase outcomes. He allows outcomes to bend toward him. This is why explanations weaken positions. Every time you explain unprompted, you assume the other person has authority over your meaning. You invite judgment. You surrender tempo. Silence refuses that transfer of power. It keeps interpretation unresolved. And unresolved meaning is uncomfortable for those who need clarity to feel in control. People often say they value honesty and openness. What they actually value is predictability. Silence denies them that. It removes the familiar markers they use to assess advantage. Without cues, they begin to overcorrect. They reveal too much. They commit too early. They fill the space with assumptions that work against them. This is not manipulation. It is exposure. The void does not force anyone to speak.
It simply does not rescue them from their own impulses. When someone talks themselves into a weaker position, that is not because silence attacked them. It is because their internal structure could not tolerate uncertainty.
This is why restraint is the foundation of this mindset. Without restraint, silence becomes brittle. The moment pressure increases, the undisciplined man rushes to restore balance. He speaks to relieve discomfort. He clarifies to soothe anxiety. He abandons the void the instant it becomes heavy. The disciplined man does the opposite. He lets the weight settle. He understands that time is an amplifier. The longer silence holds, the more meaning others project onto it. Not because he demands authority, but because authority is assigned to what does not react. Calmness under ambiguity signals depth. People assume there is something they are missing. Often, they are correct. This dynamic quietly reshapes negotiations. Whoever speaks next reveals priority. Whoever rushes to fill silence reveals dependence. Whoever cannot sit still without reassurance exposes where leverage truly lies. None of this requires confrontation. None of it requires dominance. It requires patience. Patience is misunderstood as passivity. In reality, it is delayed action backed by certainty. The void is not an end state. It is a holding pattern that gathers information. While others talk, you observe. While they justify, you learn. While they negotiate against themselves, you remain still. This is how power accumulates without friction. Most men will never experience this kind of leverage because it feels counterintuitive. They equate activity with control, movement with strength, noise with presence. Silence threatens those beliefs. It suggests that influence can exist without display. That realization alone destabilizes fragile egos. By now, the foundation should be clear. Silence is not about withholding words. It is about withholding need. When you no longer require immediate resolution, approval, or understanding, the dynamic shifts. The room adjusts. The other person carries the weight, and the void does what it always does. It reveals. Once you understand silence as pressure rather than absence, the pattern becomes impossible to unsee. The void does not operate through intimidation or demand. It works by removing the external structures people rely on to manage themselves. What remains is exposure. When silence enters an interaction, it creates asymmetry. One side is still, the other is not. That imbalance immediately activates the human need to restore equilibrium. Most people attempt to do this verbally. They add context, they offer reassurance, they soften edges that were never sharp. Each addition is an attempt to regain control. This is where revelation begins. People reveal themselves fastest when they are trying to manage perception without feedback. In silence, they cannot tell how they are being received. That uncertainty pushes them to overcompensate. They talk more than intended. They revisit points already made. They explain motivations that were never questioned. None of this is strategic. It is involuntary. The void does not interrogate. It simply listens. And listening without interruption is rare enough to feel threatening. When no response arrives, people begin to narrate their own internal dialogue. What they value, what they fear, what outcome they are trying to avoid. They leak information through emphasis, pacing, and repetition. A disciplined man notices this immediately. He hears what is being defended, not just what is being said. He notices which points are returned to, which details are volunteered, which justifications arrive too early. Silence sharpens perception because it removes the distraction of reply. This is why silence collects currency. Every word spoken in the void is data. Every explanation is a signal.
Every emotional fluctuation is information about leverage. The quiet man does not need to ask probing questions. The vacuum does that work for him. People interrogate themselves when left alone with uncertainty. Most importantly, they begin negotiating internally, out loud.
They soften demands preemptively. They introduce compromises without invitation. They attempt to preempt imagined objections. In doing so, they lower their own position, not because they are weak, but because they are uncomfortable. Silence forces them to resolve tension on their own, and resolution often means concession. This is where many misunderstand the mechanism. They assume silence is meant to dominate. It is not. It simply refuses to carry the other person's discomfort. When you do not absorb their anxiety, they must process it themselves. That processing changes behavior. Silence also strips away performative confidence. Many people appear decisive only when reinforced by reaction. Without nods, affirmations, or counters, their certainty erodes. They begin to hedge. They qualify statements. They backtrack subtly. The void exposes how much of their confidence was borrowed from engagement. This effect compounds over time. At first, silence feels neutral. Then it feels heavy. Then it feels judgmental, even if no judgment exists. People project authority onto stillness because they are used to power announcing itself. When it does not, they assume it is concealed. That assumption alone alters their posture. You will notice shifts in body language, increased movement, adjustments, forced laughter, a change in tone. These are attempts to re-establish connection and regain footing. Silence denies those attempts without resistance. The disciplined man remains unchanged. This constancy is what breaks patterns. Humans are pattern-seeking. They look for cause and effect. When effect disappears, they become unsettled. They test boundaries by speaking more, revealing more, hoping for reaction. Each test that goes unanswered increases the pressure. Eventually, something gives. Either they retreat, having exhausted their need for validation, or they overextend, revealing something they intended to conceal. In both cases, the outcome favors the one who remains silent. Not because he won an exchange, but because he gathered clarity while the others spent energy. This is why the void cannot be faked. If you are internally reactive, silence will feel unbearable. You will feel compelled to correct assumptions, to manage impressions, to regain control through explanation. The moment you break, the leverage collapses. The other person senses it immediately. Silence loses its gravity when it is abandoned for comfort. True silence requires internal order. You must be able to tolerate misinterpretation. You must be willing to let others sit in uncertainty longer than they want. You must accept that some people will project negative meaning onto your stillness. That projection is not your responsibility. In fact, it is the point. The void acts as a filter. Those who are grounded will not be disturbed by it. Those who are insecure will unravel inside it. This is not cruelty. It is differentiation. Silence reveals compatibility, stability, and intent faster than conversation ever could. By now, the mechanism should be clear. Silence creates a vacuum. Vacuums pull. What gets pulled out is not strength, but weakness. Not because silence attacks, but because it removes cover. And once revealed, weakness cannot be unseen. What remains is the final question. Not how to use the void, but whether you should. Because silence carries consequences, and not everyone who steps into it comes out unchanged. By now, it should be obvious that silence is not a neutral tool. It changes outcomes because it changes people. And anything that alters human behavior without force carries a cost. The void gives leverage, but it also removes insulation. You are no longer protected by noise, warmth, or misunderstanding. You become exposed in a different way. Silence isolates, not socially, but structurally. When you stop rushing to explain yourself, fewer people feel entitled to your inner world. Casual connections thin out. Weak bonds dissolve. People who rely on constant affirmation will drift away, often framing your restraint as distance, coldness, or superiority. This is not punishment. It is sorting. The void does not reward neediness. It rewards stability. Many men enter silence expecting respect. What they encounter first is discomfort. Others will test you. They will provoke reaction, sometimes subtly, sometimes directly. Jokes sharpen. Assumptions are floated. Misinterpretations are left hanging. These are attempts to pull you back into familiar dynamics. If you respond defensively, the void collapses. If you overcorrect, it loses credibility. Silence only works when it is not trying to work. The moment you use it to posture, it becomes transparent. This is where imitation fails. Weak men copy the surface behavior. They stop speaking, but internally they are agitated. Their silence is brittle. It leaks through micro-reactions, facial tension, restless movement. Others sense the incongruence immediately. Instead of gravity, it creates awkwardness. Instead of leverage, it creates mistrust. The void requires internal coherence. You must be at peace with not being understood immediately. You must accept that some outcomes will take longer. You must relinquish the need to control perception in real time. That relinquishment has consequences. When you no longer explain yourself, people assign meaning without your input. Sometimes that meaning benefits you. Sometimes it does not. Silence does not guarantee favorable interpretation. It guarantees honest projection. You will see how others truly think, but they will also see less of you. That asymmetry is powerful, but it is also lonely. There is a reason most men choose noise. Noise keeps them connected, even if it costs them leverage. Silence demands self-sufficiency. You must generate your own certainty, your own validation, your own sense of position. Without that internal structure, silence becomes emptiness instead of pressure. The void also sharpens responsibility. When you speak less, your words carry more weight. You cannot hide behind volume. When you finally say something, it lands. That means you must be precise. Casual statements become commitments. Offhand remarks become signals. The quiet man is judged by fewer data points, and each one matters more. This is why the void is not a shortcut. It is not a way to win arguments or outmaneuver people casually. It is a long-term posture that changes how others relate to you. Some will rise to meet it. Others will collapse under it. You do not get to choose who does which, and you cannot turn it off selectively. Once you are known as someone who does not rush, does not over-explain, and does not react on demand, expectations shift. People approach you differently. Conversations slow down. Words are chosen more carefully around you. The space you carry begins to shape environments. That shaping is not always comfortable. Silence attracts projection. Authority, suspicion, curiosity, all at once. You will be blamed for things you did not say, credited for intentions you did not have. This is the price of opacity. The void gives you leverage, but it also removes the shield of transparency. The disciplined man accepts this trade. He understands that silence is not moral or immoral. It is structural. It reorganizes dynamics because humans cannot tolerate unresolved space. Whether that reorganization is constructive or destructive depends on the stability of those involved.
This is why silence should be used with restraint, not indulgence. Not to crush, but to clarify. Not to dominate, but to observe. The void is not a weapon you swing. It is a terrain you occupy. And terrain always favors those who know how to stand still. Silence does not announce itself. It does not justify its presence. It does not explain what it is doing. It simply remains. And in that remaining, others reveal everything.